Good morning. Just checking to see that you can hear me.
We can.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Boulay, are you ready?
Good morning, I'm ready.
Thank you. Good morning. We're now on the record. It's 9 a.m. on Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. This is an evidentiary proceeding, an evidentiary hearing in proceeding number 21A-0141E, Public Service Company of Colorado's Electric Resource and Clean Energy Plan regarding the proposed Unit 3 performance incentive mechanisms. Eric Blank, the chair of the commission. Can my colleagues introduce themselves for the record, starting with Commissioner Plant?
I am Commissioner Tom Plant.
Good morning, Commissioner Megan Gilman.
Thanks. Let's start with the entries of appearance by the parties. Public Service Company.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Matthew Larson, Wilkinson Barker Nauer, LLP. On behalf of Public Service Company of Colorado, I'd also like to enter the appearance of Christopher Irby.
Thank you. Next on my list is City of Denver. City of Pueblo, the Pueblo Board of Waterworks.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Mark Davis, the law firm Fairfield and Woods, appearing on behalf of the City of Pueblo and Pueblo Board of Waterworks. Thank you.
Thank you. Colorado Energy Office.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. First Assistant Attorney General Jessica Lowry, representing the Colorado Energy Office.
Colorado Office of Just Transition. Colorado Oil and Gas Association. COSA-SIA. Holy Cross Electric Association. International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, Local 111. Pueblo County.
Good morning, Commissioners. Francis Consilia on behalf of Pueblo County.
Rocky Mountain Environmental Labor Coalition, Colorado Building and Construction Trades Council. Trial staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Paul Kite. I'm a First Assistant Attorney General representing trial staff in this proceeding, and I would like to introduce, if I may, the newest member of our unit who will enter her appearance right now.
Good morning, Commissioners and Mr. Chairman. Aileen Chong, Assistant Attorney General, appearing on behalf of trial staff.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Utility Consumer Advocate.
Good morning, Your Honor. Thomas Dixon appearing on behalf of the Utility Consumer Advocate.
Welcome, Mr. Dixon.
Thank you.
Western Resource Advocates.
Good morning, Commissioners. Parks Barroso on behalf of Western Resource Advocates.
Welcome. Conservation Coalition.
Morning, Chair and Commissioners. Matt Gerhart on behalf of the Conservation Coalition. And we don't have any cross-examination time and are not presenting any witnesses, so I'd ask to be excused.
So excused.
Thank you.
Interwest Energy Alliance. Onward Energy Management.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Sarah Judkins with Kaplan Kirsch LLP on behalf of Onward Energy. Onward is not taking a position with any issues related to the Unit 3 PIM and would ask to be excused from this hearing.
So excused. Thank you. Colorado Independent Energy Association.
Good morning, Chair. Daniel Rubin on behalf of the Colorado Independent Energy Association.
Intermountain Rural, actually Core Electric Cooperative. Vote Solar.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Michael Hyatt with Earth Justice, appearing on behalf of Vote Solar. Vote Solar also does not plan to participate today, so I would ask to be excused, please.
So excused. Thank you, sir. City of Boulder. Colorado Renewable Energy Society. Climax.
Morning, Your Honor. Richard Alfano on behalf of Climax Molybdenum Company.
Thank you. Colorado Energy Consumers.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Michelle King of the law firm Holland and Hart. I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Energy Consumers.
And finally, Commission Counsel.
Thank you, Chair. Erin McLaughlin, Commission Counsel.
And did I miss anyone? We're going to conduct this hearing using electronic exhibits. A spreadsheet marked as Hearing Exhibit 2903 lists the latest versions of the pre-filed testimony, attachments, and other exhibits. With that, any objection to the omission of Hearing Exhibit 2903, the spreadsheet listing all of the exhibits? We'll get to the individual exhibits in a minute, but any concerns with Hearing Exhibit 2903? Mr. Larson? Mr.
No objection from Public Service.
Mr. Fanyo?
No objection. I've got another one a little bit down the road. So.
All right. We'll get there in a sec. Is there a stipulation among the parties omitting all the items listed on Hearing Exhibit 2903? Or if not, any objection to omitting all the documents contained on Hearing Exhibit 2903? Mr. Larson.
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of any objection to the omission of the exhibits on Hearing Exhibit 2903.
Anyone else? All right. All those exhibits are admitted. Mr. Fanyo.
Thank you, Your Honor. Climax reserved cross-examination time for Mr. Pasgucci and Ms. O'Neill. And I want to advise you and the parties that we are waiving that cross-exam.
Thank you, sir. Ms. King.
Likewise, CEC waives its cross of Mr. Pascucci and Miss O'Neill. And we advised the parties and Public Service Company of that yesterday. So just wanted to apprise the commission of that as well.
Thank you, Ms. King. Any other, and I think Commission Counsel has said they had no questions. Any other preliminary matters? Mr. Larson, I think you want to call your first witness, and I'll try and listen and see if I can pronounce his name properly.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Chair. And we do have Dan Huddleston and Manny Zuring available for commission questions in the event that Mr. Pascucci needs to defer any questions to them. So they're available as well. But with that, I would call Michael V. Pascucci to the stand.
Mr. Pascucci, can you hold up your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
You can put your hand down. Is anybody with you or communicating with you in any way?
No.
If that changes, you'll let us know.
Yes.
Back to you, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Pascucci.
Good morning, Mr. Larson.
Can you please state and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is Michael Pascucci, Michael Pascucci.
What is your title at the company?
I'm Director of Regulatory Policy for Public Service Company of Colorado.
And do you have before you what have been marked as hearing exhibit 163, which is your PIM testimony, hearing exhibit 164, which is your supplemental PIM testimony, and hearing exhibit 165, which is your responsive PIM testimony?
Yes, I do.
And were those prepared by you or under your direction?
Yes, they were.
And with that, I don't believe there's any cross-examination for Mr. Pascucci, Mr. Chair, so he is available for commission questions.
Commissioner Plant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Pascucci. I had just a couple of quick questions. In your attachment MVP 1, you have a baseline outage factor for each year of 7.9%. And then in your supplemental testimony, you cite planned outages each year that are higher than that. They're 9.6% in 25 and 26, 15% in 28 and 29, 29 is 8.2, and 2030 is 15%. So how did you arrive at the 7.9% number? What does that represent exactly?
The 7.9% factor is representative of the numbers that were used in the phase 1 and phase 2 modeling. So is the number that was used in the Encompass modeling for which the resource acquisitions and solicitations were based on that analysis. Do you mind referencing me to the page where I had the other numbers that you were inquiring?
I can, yeah, I can try. It's basically the outages that are planned that you have in 164. Basically on page, let's see, what is this, 7 and 8.
Thank you, and just wanted to make sure I'm looking at the right numbers. Yes, the baseline number was what was used in the phase 2 analysis, and was the assumptions that the Encompass model used for the purposes of calculating kind of runtimes and resource acquisitions. As far as would you mind, wasn't sure if you could scroll down just a little bit further. And apologies, actually, maybe scroll up just a little bit. See the question in there. And thank you. If you could scroll down just a little bit. You can keep going. Apologies, Commissioner Plant. I think you're okay there. Could you repeat your question? I thought you had expressed a couple of percentages that I wasn't seeing here.
Yeah, no, the percentages aren't written. I just basically took a 25-day, or I guess it's 35 days in 2025 and divided it into 365 days to come up with a percentage. I thought that it might be where you had your 7.9% from, but all the percentages came out higher, some significantly higher, twice as much in both 2030 and 2027. There's plans for significant outages, 55 days, I think. So I was just wondering where the 7.9% came from.
Yeah, and as I said, that 7.9% came from what was in the modeling. So the baseline assumption, consistent with the Commission's Phase 1 decision to use the assumptions in Phase 2 as the baseline for the Comanche 3 PIM, we brought those over. Mr. Zarang may have some additional context around dates that are in here, but my presumption would be what's happened with the dates is what was included in Phase 2 was based on the best information available at that time. And as time has elapsed over the last few years, outage schedules, outage expectations have changed slightly and shifted around a little bit.
Should we use these numbers as the baseline outage numbers for the spreadsheet that you provided with MVP1?
I don't think we should use these numbers for the baseline. The Phase 1 decision, as I mentioned, required us to utilize the Phase 2 assumptions, and that's the Phase 2 assumptions are what we use to make, or what the Commission used to make its decisions and its approvals of the resource acquisition plan. And I believe for consistency purposes, it makes the most sense to use one set baseline that was used for making those decisions and then hold the company accountable and to adhering to those or doing better than those baseline assumptions. And that was a lot of the thought process that went into our development of the PIM amongst the stakeholders when we developed it. Was we made decisions based on the information you provided us in Phase 2. We now want a PIM that holds the company accountable for either meeting or exceeding those baselines.
Okay, thank you. And I understand that the aux boiler doesn't fall under the timeframes of the PIM, but it's certainly been discussed in the testimony. And I was just wondering if you could explain the purpose of the aux boiler.
Yes, I think I can give you a high-level idea of the aux boiler, and certainly if you have additional questions or want to get into the technical details, I think Mr. Zarang is the best person to speak to about that. But the aux boiler is, with the retirement of Comanche 2 at the end of 2025, the aux boiler is necessary for when Comanche 3 shuts down to start the unit back up. Today, if Comanche 3 is shut down, we can use Comanche 2 to start it back up and to get systems kind of up and running. But in the future, when you don't have Comanche 2, you need an alternative system to put that in place. So in order to maintain the unit and keep it running when those planned outages do occur in the future, the aux boiler was necessary to get that startup process going.
Okay. And is there any use for the aux boiler within the system after Unit 3 has been retired? Or is it kind of a $20 million expense for just a few years?
That's a question I have to refer you to Mr. Zarang on. I'm not sure of the answer to that.
And is it true that Unit 3 cannot begin operations without the aux boiler running? Is that it doesn't have the capability to basically start on its own?
Yes, that's correct. The unit was not designed to start on its own, and absent the aux boiler could not start without another unit kind of being on site, like Comanche 2 does today.
And do you know, is it a gas boiler or is it a coal-fired boiler, or what? Do you know? Can you give us any information about?
I don't know for certain if it's gas or if it's coal. I think Mr. Zarang, again, probably best to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thanks.
Commissioner Gilman.
Good morning, Mr. Pascucci.
Good morning, Commissioner Gilman.
Okay. I want to start us off talking about deviations in the forecast.
Okay.
So as you're familiar, we have 4 forecasts, phase 1, ERP, 2023 ERP annual report, phase 2 ERP, and 2024 ERP annual report.
Yes, that's correct.
Reasonable. Okay. So the company, really you in your testimony, state that forecasts for phase 1 and phase 2 assumed very different lifespan and operational characteristics for unit 3. So I was curious, what specific changes did the company make to the forecast between phase 1 and phase 2 to account for the difference in operations?
So phase 1 did assume that, as I discussed in my testimony, phase 1 assumed that the unit retirement was 2040, that it did not have reduced operations. It ran kind of in a normal operating sequence. In phase 2, the cost assumptions, the O&M and capital assumptions that were used were modified to reflect some of the recommendations that staff had made in, I believe it was the testimony of Dr. Dalkey in phase 1. He had made some adjustments to costs. So in phase 2, the company, I think, took those, conferred with staff to verify that we had captured the accurate information, and then simply included those in. So whether there are discrete changes to assume for reduced operations that this is how the plant would operate, I don't believe we made changes specifically for an assumption of how the unit would operate. It was still kind of an open question internally, even at the time of phase 2, how the unit would operate under reduced operations. As far as the lifetime goes, I believe there were some changes made to capital assumptions as far as different projects that may or may not be needed and some overhauls. But again, not materially different, in order to try and align with what I believe, if my recollection is correct, was the phase 1 order to confer with staff and update the numbers consistent with those that staff had provided in the testimony of Dr. Dalkey.
Okay, and just for clarity purposes, as I recall from phase 1, Dr. Dalkey's recommendations were based on the actual historical cost of O&M to operate the plant, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And that's in phase 1, what the company's forecast was we had used a 5-year historic period.
I think he sneezed.
Thank you. The company had used a 5-year historic average and then escalated it in the modeling. And I think Dr. Dalkey had made some adjustments based on that historic forecast of O&M as well. And so we adopted that and brought that in.
Okay.
They weren't prospective looks, I guess, is the confirmation I was trying to provide.
Okay, so if you look at a picture in 2023, the plant life essentially decreased between phase 1 and phase 2 from 17 more years to 7 more years of operations. Are there specific capital improvements or O&M expenses that the company removed from the forecasting to acknowledge a decade less of expected operations of the plant?
Do you mind if I just flip open to that attachment MVP 1, or sorry, attachment MVP 2? I was going to look at that for a moment and see if there was anything specific I would note for you. So in looking at it and looking back at some of my testimony, I'm not sure that there were specific things that we removed per se, but some things did shift. I believe it was my supplemental testimony. We had talked about a couple of capital projects that shifted related to, I'll kind of say ash control, coal ash control. There were some costs where we had in earlier years forecasted needing to invest in some capital that were pushed out because of actual operations or historic operations. And there were some other projects that I think we shifted between years. One was a bag house project, I believe, that we accelerated one part of it and delayed another part to combine the two projects in order to capture some efficiencies in doing both projects at the same time rather than separating them. But just looking back, I don't know that there's anything specific that I could call out for you today that we directly removed from there.
Okay. And then looking further at some of the different forecasting, between, you note in your testimony, the 2023 ERP annual report was a comprehensive O&M forecast, including costs beyond those associated with planned overhauls. But then you say the 2024 ERP annual report provided a narrower O&M forecast that was limited to O&M costs associated with planned overhauls. So I guess first, you know in your testimony that these were developed by the same groups. So I'm curious why there was such a discrepancy in how the company conducted two forecasts.
So the forecasts themselves, the discrepancy really results from different interpretations of, I believe it was the settlement agreement, the updated settlement agreement in this proceeding. That had required us in the annual report to provide information on Comanche 3 and its O&M costs. And between 23 and 24, the interpretation, I believe, changed. And in 23, we provided the full. And then in 24, in working on that report, it was just interpreted differently to only apply specifically to the overhauls. So I'd say it was not a function of the forecasting, our finance and energy supply teams creating different forecasts or misforecasting, but a function of most likely, I think, my fault of the direction that we gave to the teams of the information that we needed for the report that just read the rule or read the requirement differently in 2 years and provided different information.
Okay. So what costs specifically are missing from the 2024 ERP annual report that would have been in there if you had interpreted the same as you did in 2023 annual report?
Apologies, I was just looking real quick to see if I made a specific reference in my testimony to that difference.
No, take your time.
And so just kind of looking back and refreshing my memory there, my understanding is the difference is rather than including all O&M, so all the costs associated with operating the plants in 2020, which was provided in the 2023 forecast. In the 2024 forecast, what we provided was simply those associated with overhauls, the replacement projects that were being done or kind of update projects that were being done in that year. So there would have been some costs, I believe, like chemicals. There would probably have been some materials or some labor costs that were excluded from the 2024 forecast, since it was more narrowly focused on a subset of operations, not the broad annual operations. Does that Does that help?
Yeah, I think. So does the company have any document that shows a 2024 forecast that would be more akin to how it was done in 2023, including the full subset of costs?
Yes, that's what we attempted to provide in my responsive testimony, was an update that provided the full 2024 forecast, as well as we provided actuals to date. At that time, I think it was through the end of July, we provided actuals for that year. So recognizing it, as you note, that 23 forecast was a more comprehensive look, 24 was a more limited look in the annual report. In my responsive testimony, we instead provided both the comprehensive 2023 and comprehensive 2024, as well as the actuals for the first 6 to 7 months of 2024. I believe that was in attachment MVP3.
All right, MVP3.
MVP3, yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I probably confused myself with the forecast a few times. So
Totally understand, yes.
helpful to know where to look. Okay. So in your responsive testimony, you kind of described the development of the phase 2 forecast and saying it was developed for modeling purposes using an average of 5 years of historical actual data available at the time, which I recall was the directive to work with staff on that, applying an escalation rate. Are you familiar with what the escalation rate was?
I believe it was approximately 2%. It was like a long-term inflation assumption.
Okay. And extrapolating the average forecast through the end of life. So it sounds like the starting point for that was developed with staff in that action directed by the commission. Were there any deviations going into the future from simply applying an escalation rate of 2%?
I'm not sure I understand when you're asking deviations, or what exactly you meant by that. I'm sorry.
So if I calculate annual increases in fixed O&M over the duration of each document's forecast, as I understand them, the phase 1 and phase 2 forecasts include some fairly significant jumps from 2025 to 2026 that significantly exceed 2%. But the same jumps I do not see present in the 2003 and 2004 annual reports. So there seems to be somewhat of a discrepancy that I'm trying to figure out in terms of what was the anticipation for that major jump in expenses from 25 to 26, and why does that not also appear in the annual report?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, was just
So
looking.
take your time. There's a lot of stuff.
There are a lot of years, a lot of numbers, and a lot of vintages, yes.
Yeah.
And that's where it may be helpful if I think attachment MVP3.
Yeah, I think we can pull it up.
I think if we can pull that one up, it may just help as we're talking about it to make sure I'm looking at the same numbers you're looking at.
Sure.
Could we zoom in just a little bit? Thank you. And so what you were asking here is effectively, for example, if I look at I think you said 2025, where the phase 1 model had approximately $32 million in the O&M expense. And then in phase 2, it increases to 40. And then in the 2023 forecast, it again drops back down to 32. And then in 2024, jumps back up to 36, and kind of why the variation year to year, some of which is noticeably significant.
Yeah, so more specifically, if you look at the phase 1 and phase 2, between 25 and 26, there's a major jump. But that does not appear, a major jump does not appear in the annual report.
So believe it's a function of a couple of different factors. One is in the phase 2 assumption for common costs, the modeling team, when they put the information into Encompass and when they worked with the finance team they were working with to put it together, since they were using that historic assumption on costs, any changes to common cost allocations or any assumptions about reductions in common costs were not necessarily factored into there. So they took them, extrapolated them out, and put just kind of held everything else constant. And so that explained part of the difference. And that's where I think I noted in my responsive testimony that how that changes in the future, that allocation of common costs amongst the joint owners, will result in variations in future forecasts as we finalize that. My understanding is the other driver is assumptions about labor, that as Comanche units 1 and 2 retired, there were some assumptions in reduced labor needs. And those did carry through into the 23 and 24 annual reports to some degree, but were not factored into the phase 2. As we've come to find out today, and I think we'll see this in next year's ERP annual report, is that those assumptions of declining labor costs associated with the retirement of common costs are likely not as significant as we expected. That's due in part to many of the common systems that exist amongst all 3 plants today are still needed. And so the company, where we had previously thought we may be able to reduce some labor headcount as other units retired, has found that no, in order to maintain safe, reliable operation and maintain those common systems, we'll need a similar level of employees. The other factor is as the units are retired, in order to maintain a deep bench of skilled and knowledgeable employees on the operations side, we have kind of intended to retain most of the employees that are there. That helps in that as attrition occurs, rather than going out and acquiring new employees, bringing them in and training them up, we can use the existing ones. So I think the main discrepancies you're seeing there are just how common costs are considered and allocated, and then a function of the 23 and 24 reports assuming some reduction in O&M labor, whereas what we actually are expecting is, and phase 2 more accurately represents that, is labor will stay relatively consistent through the end of life.
But the 2024 annual ERP report is far newer. I mean, maybe far is, but is significantly newer than the phase 2 report. And this seems like a somewhat recent revelation with regard to labor. So why is the older forecast more accurate with regard to labor than the newer forecast?
So I would say the phase 2, the accuracy is more a function of just taking historic and escalating it out. It wasn't a intentional decision made by that group. The 23 and 24 forecasts were newer. They were developed in December of 2022 and December of 2023. And at that time, the company was still anticipating some reduction or some adjustment in labor, whether it's outside services or it's employee labor, that there would be some decline in that. And I should have been more clear, but was kind of foreshadowing that in the 2025 annual report, I expect the forecast to go back up as we've revised that assumption that labor would continue to decline through end of life, and it's more likely to remain steady at a steady state through end of life.
Okay, understood. And the phase 1 and phase 2, as we look at this document, MVP 3, the phase 1 and phase 2 don't appear to break out labor in the way that the annual reports do. Is that accessible anywhere?
It's correct that they don't break them out specifically, and I don't believe we had them specifically broken out that way. What it is it's an oddity, I guess, of how the modeling is done for resource planning purposes versus how the kind of internal financial forecasting is done. From a modeling perspective, the Encompass model doesn't need to differentiate between the individual categories, which is why we've presented it in the past in the model as kind of fixed versus variable, fixed being not related to dispatch versus variable being related to dispatch. And the Encompass model just requires you to input, this is what the fixed cost of the unit is. And then the variable is a kind of dollar per megawatt hour cost that adjusts the total cost based on how much the Encompass model forecasts it to operate. So it's kind of done from a top-down approach of what does the model need in order to calculate a result, versus the 23 and 24 ERP annual report forecasts are done bottoms up, where the energy supply and finance teams break things out into more discrete categories and build up from there. So I don't know that I could specifically within the fixed O&M, and it was something we did try to do, but weren't successful in really being able to break out fixed O&M. Here are the components, here are the individual line items of those. It was, I think, just a function of taking a 5-year average, breaking it into fixed and variable O&M for the purposes of modeling, and then extrapolating it out from there.
Okay. The one part I would say you lost me on is looking at the cost allocation and how that influences this potential jump from 25 to 26. I guess, what is the company's assumption within the phase 2 modeling about cost allocation of those common pieces as it proceeds into the future?
Yeah, my understanding is when we conducted the phase 1 and phase 2 modeling, we used, again, the 5-year average, which assumed all common costs, all shared services were still in place since they were in place during that period, and that they were allocated based on the existing ownership share amongst the kind of 3 joint owners of the units down in Pueblo. And that just, it didn't make any discrete adjustments. The modeling team didn't go in and say, okay, common costs should decline like this, or shares amongst the owners should change like this. It just took that 5-year average, and I believe that's exactly how Dr. Dahlke had it as well, is this is a 5-year average, we're not changing for these things, and took it out. So to the extent that it assumed that no common costs go away, that no common costs change during the remaining life, that is something that the model have had assumed in there, versus in the annual years, it doesn't we assume some decline. So is that a little bit more clear?
It's helpful to understand what your assumption was for cost allocations. If I'm hearing you right, even though units 1 and 2 will shut down, will close, there may be a reallocation. Certain things will go away. Certain things may get reallocated that still have to be used, that are only serving unit 3 now and used to serve 3 different plants. Still not so clear why there's a big jump in forecast between 25 and 26, to be honest.
And that's maybe
it's about a 20% jump, whereas the average annual increase is 2%.
And that's maybe where I'll maybe start to defer then to Mr. Huddleston. He may have a little bit more insight into the specifics there. Mr. Zarang may as well.
Okay. And then just to be more clear, as you did the modeling for phase 2 and looked at common costs, what you're saying is you just essentially used the historical values and projected forward. So really no influence of the closure of units 1 and 2?
I think that's accurate. The phase 2 assumptions didn't really have a discrete adjustment made for the closure of 1 or 2 baked into them, since they were using, I believe it was 2016 through 2020 assumptions. Since it was just assumed for a 5-year period, they didn't make any discrete adjustments or anything like that. For, okay, Comanche Unit 2 is going to retire, so we don't need X service anymore. The modeling didn't account for that. That's where I was trying to note earlier, is that ultimately I think phase 2 may be a little bit more realistic in that sense, is that while some systems may go away, some labor may not be needed, overall, we're not expecting anymore that reduction in labor or that reduction in shared services, common costs that reflect in the 23 and 24 annual report numbers.
Okay. In your, I get all these names confused. In your responsive testimony, you indicated that your generation business area does not use the fixed and variable distinctions for the purpose of 5-year forecasting and actual cost accounting. But the company here has proposed that only the fixed O&M would be part of the PIM, right? And variable would be outside of its reach.
Yes, for the most part, we can align as best we can the costs, but there's two distinctions to provide there. The costs that were input into the Encompass model for phase 1 and phase 2 were not broken up into discrete buckets to say, if we have $20 million of fixed O&M, here's how that was broken up. Whereas when they do the bottom-up approach, they look at, here's all the discrete things. What we attempted to do again in that MVP3 through the highlighting was highlight the costs that would fit into a fixed O&M versus a variable O&M, or at least denote in that kind of pinkish hue the costs that would fall into a fixed O&M. So while we don't do our financial forecasting that way for purposes of revenue forecasting, cost forecasting, gap reporting, we don't break them out into fixed versus variable O&M. The finance team, we kind of all work together to say, okay, what would fit into the bucket then of fixed O&M? What is independent of dispatch? That whether you run the plant at 100% or 0%, what costs are going to remain essentially fixed during the course of a year? And that's where I think if you look at that MVP3, we have employee expenses, labor, materials, miscellaneous, and outside services. We treated those as they are fixed O&M costs. They're ones that if the plant runs 365 days of a year, those costs are going to be there. If it runs 10 days a year, those costs are still going to be there because you're effectively, for example, with employees, with labor costs, you're not going to furlough the entire plant for 300 days and then expect to bring them back when you do run the plant. Alternatively, the things such as like chemicals, those are dependent on if the plant is running and operating, you're using chemicals. If the plant is not, I think your chemicals are very different there.
What color line would the chemicals be in?
Chemicals is actually, it is a green line in there. So if you're looking in there, commodities, chemicals is green. Fuel handling was another cost I believe we removed from consideration. Again, that fuel handling cost being a function of operating the plant, so more of a variable cost. The one variable cost that we did include in the PIM baseline for O&M is water. And that was one that I think both Ms. O'Neill and I explained. We left water in because while it is from a modeling perspective, it's viewed as a variable cost. The water cost for Comanche 3 is a take or pay contract with the Pueblo Board of Waterworks. So whether the unit runs or not, we pay the same amount. And so this gave us an incentive to seek alternative uses of that water agreement so that the company is, one, not necessarily penalized for a fixed water contract that's been in place for several years now, but has an incentive to, whether it's through new generation or if we can come to an agreement with the Pueblo Board of Waterworks for an alternative arrangement, we still have a financial incentive to reduce that cost to customers.
Okay. And I guess one thing that makes me wary is understanding this is not how you do your actual accounting, separating these. So does the company have a plan in place moving forward to kind of discreetly and consistently separate these costs appropriately if that's not been your historic accounting practice?
So for the purposes of the PIM, I think we've kind of outlined in this attachment MVP3 exactly what costs would fit in fixed O&M. So when you see, let's say, the 2025 ERP annual report forecast, we would have employee expenses, labor, materials, miscellaneous, and outside services. Those costs would go into the fixed O&M calculation of the 2025 PIM when we reconcile that. So I think from a perspective of the commissioners or stakeholders wanting to understand, okay, what is the company's forecast for 2025 and what costs are going to be calculated? It is those kind of pinkish hue highlighted costs that would be used for that calculation. So it really comes down to a distinction of the need for granularity in the model is lower than the need for granularity in financial forecasting. The model doesn't necessarily care the difference between material cost and labor cost, but for financial forecasting, we do care. So hopefully that gives a little bit of clarity into going forward. When you see these ERP annual reports, you'll be able to see, and we can certainly highlight and delineate that these are what consist of the fixed O&M versus these are what are excluded from the calculation of the PIM.
And in those future ERP, this might be a little out of the bounds of what we're doing today, but in those future ERP annual reports, are you going to be able to present the information consistently to show the same boundary of information from year to year?
Yes, we will make sure that in future years we provide we're planning to provide a comprehensive forecast of O&M each year. So not just related to overhauls as we talked about earlier, but full plant operations. And I think it's totally reasonable for us to highlight or denote in those forecasts what's fixed versus so applicable to the PIM versus what's variable, so not applicable to the PIM.
Okay, thank you. So in your testimony, you talked through in comparing the forecast that essentially phase 2, 2023 and 2024 annual reports are the most similar in that they all acknowledge the same operational characteristics and retirement dates for the unit, correct?
Yes, they do reflect, I think, the most up-to-date information that we had at the time of development. That's always one of the hard parts in this is obviously as time goes on, things do change. So there's always some variation between each vintage of forecast.
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned that the differences are due to, quote, changing conditions on the ground, like regular evaluation and updating of capital forecasts using the best information available at the time of the forecast. Now, in 2024, the company executed what you just described in your testimony as a complete overhaul of Unit 3, correct?
Yes.
Did the phase 2 modeling that was done for the ERP capture any future changes that would or could have been caused by the complete overhaul that was done in 2024?
From a capital perspective or an O&M perspective?
Either or both.
From an O&M perspective, no, I don't think it would have captured any of those assumptions for the simple fact that it was a historic O&M value versus a prospective kind of bottoms up development. From a capital perspective, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% confident, but I would assume similarly it doesn't because it didn't use a historic capital assumption. It did use a forecast capital assumption at the time, which was developed in 2020. And it was based on the assumption that the unit would be in service through 2040. So I don't think, sorry, the phase 1, I don't think there would have been any assumption of capital savings from that 2024 overhaul consistent with what we're seeing in 23 and 24. In phase 2, again, I think similarly, the capital costs, there were, other than the aux boiler, and I think some other minor and discrete changes in capital forecasting, there was nothing specific taken into account to say, okay, an overhaul in this year means X, Y, and Z in future years.
Okay. Did the 2024 ERP annual report capture any changes to O&M or capital expectations as a result of the 2024 overhaul?
I don't know the answer to that question. I might ask you, refer you to Mr. Huddleston or Mr. Zarang on that one.
Okay. Second. Color code for myself. So in your, let me get the terminology right, your supplemental PIM testimony, you described cost overruns on the auxiliary boiler project, about 53% of the project cost based on my calculation. And that's between the 2023 estimate and 2024 combination of actuals and estimates that was left. You go on to say in that testimony, nonetheless, in terms of total cost, the 2024 annual report forecast remains relatively similar to the assumptions modeled in the ERP phase 2 process. And I was trying to understand how with a $7 million overrun on one specific project, we ended up with forecasts that were still pretty similar.
And so if I can first, the aux boiler cost overruns aren't due to a change in scope or a reevaluation of the aux boiler project. That's remained very consistent. What's been primarily driving the cost increases on those is related to similar pressures that we're seeing with the CEP right now, EPC costs, labor and material costs. So the costs are being driven up there for factors of essentially EPC contractors saying my costs have escalated. There's more competition out there. Other people are willing to pay more. If you want me to continue working, it's going to cost more, or steel prices continuing to escalate higher than we thought. I think the primary reason or the primary reason is probably, and Mr. Huddleston or Mr. Zarang may have some additional insight into things that moved around, but is primarily related to just other capital projects shifting. So in phase 2, an assumption, when that phase 2 capital assumption was developed in 2020, 2021, and those were being put together, projects since then have started to shift around a little bit more. And so a project that was assumed for 2023, for example, I think one of those, or 2024, one of those bag house projects shifted later. So you see some capital dollars moving out of 23 and 24 and into 25 or 26, 27, whereas that helps offset some of the increase associated with the aux boiler.
Okay.
It's almost like a net effect of things happening there.
Okay. Let's see. If we could pull up attachment MPV2 for a minute. I need to look at that. It's gonna be little. Sorry. But I think you're familiar enough with this exhibit, I would expect.
Yes.
So if I look out over the years, especially past 2024, in the years in which the PIM is expected to be in place or applicable to, almost all of the phase 2 capital expenditure forecasts fall under a line called COM Emergent Fund Steam Production. It's like the 5th line there.
Mm-hmm.
On there. What does that mean?
That emergent fund is essentially a risk reserve or a contingency for capital projects that have not been identified today that may be identified in the future. So as with any kind of budget forecast. We have things that we know today or plan today that we are going to do in the future, but set aside some risk reserve or some contingency for you may experience something in the future that you didn't expect, but you want to plan for in your budget.
Okay. In the description, it's also appears to me to be in the bucket of common expenses because it starts with that COM. Why are these considered common expenses versus expenses particular to Unit 3?
That's a good question, and I might refer you to Mr. Huddleston just for the specific dynamics between that. I have some assumptions, but I think it's better to get it directly from the finance person who has more experience with that area.
Okay. And since those are listed as common, does that impact how they're treated and flowed through, I guess, based on cost allocation, since they're classified here as common expenses?
I think it would depend on the year. For example, if it's a common cost incurred in 23, 24, and I believe 25, it would be different than 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30, because you'll have that changing share of common costs between the owners, where today Piesco has a larger share. As Unit 1 retired and then Unit 2 retires, that share is expected to change as the total kind of ownership share of Piesco, I think, declines relative to the other units. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And just to be clear, for every year out to 2030, they're in that same line from what I can see. So I do think they're at least shown to be classified as common expenses for every year. So when post 2026, are you assuming a smaller share for Piesco and expected emergent expenses?
I believe that's our assumption right now, is that as Unit 2 retires, the company's total share of capacity at the Comanche station will decline. However, that conversation is still ongoing with the partners, with the two partners to the unit. So what the final share looks like is still, I'd say, in discussion. Our contracts do provide some guidance for that, but we have not solidified what in 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30 the actual shares will look like.
Okay. What's the first year that you would see potential changes in the share allocation?
I believe it would begin in 2026 following the retirement of Comanche 2 at the end of 2025.
Okay. So this may or may not be in your expertise, but I'm curious because it very much relates to these forecasts. The company is narrowing in on expected submission of an interim electric resource plan called the JTS. In preparation for that and considering the wide range of forecasts that we have before us in this proceeding, I was curious what O&M and capital forecast is most similar or reflects what the company plans to use to identify future costs of operations of the plant in the future ERP.
So in the upcoming Just Transition solicitation, the Encompass model is utilizing the same phase 2 assumptions that were used in the CEP to maintain some consistency between them. As you know, it's kind of a sort of an interim, sort of a standalone resource solicitation. So the model as of today is using the same phase 2 assumptions for Comanche Unit 2 as we had in the phase 2 CEP.
Okay. I wanted to go back to labor just for a minute. As you discussed before, we're expecting closure of 2 of the 3 units at the station. But your kind of most recent indication is that you do not expect labor costs to decrease at all. Are you expecting them to continue to increase?
So just to be clear in that, because I probably could have been more clear earlier, the 23 and 24 ERP annual reports did have some declining labor with assumptions that we wouldn't retain as much labor for the operation of common systems following the retirement of Comanche Unit 2. What I was saying is, based on the best information today, I expect those costs relative to 23 and 24 to increase in the future, as we've now identified we would not see some of those labor savings going forward. That is, again, a function of two things. One, common systems still need those employees and still need a similar level of employees to maintain them. But two, in order to reliably and cost effectively continue to operate the unit, we want to have a deep bench of experienced employees, so that as natural attrition at the plant does happen and employees leave for alternative jobs or retire, we have available a group of experienced employees who can substitute in. That does have some other benefits of retaining that labor. For example, it means less overtime is required of existing employees. So if an employee goes on vacation for 2 weeks, rather than asking somebody else to work overtime, we have that bench employee from Comanche Unit 2 who's able to step in and fill that gap to help reduce that cost.
And all those employees will remain at the same station, even upon closure of the other two units?
I think the assumption that we plan to build into the 2025 ERP forecast is an assumption that those employees are at Comanche Unit 3. Whether they remain there throughout the entire life, I think, is a question we don't have an answer to yet. It's probably dependent to some degree on what happens in the JTS. If there are new resources approved in at Comanche Station or in the Pueblo area. So over time, I expect that's another thing that will continue to evolve, is especially as we get closer to retirement of the unit, is just what happens with the development of new generation in that area and at the station, versus our employees shifting within other departments within the company.
Okay. Now, within your testimony, the first reason you gave for the expectation of not seeing really labor savings in the future was in the short term, you expect to backfill open positions, which are necessary for the operation of the plant with these existing employees. Wouldn't that in essence actually result in a savings, because you're taking an open position and taking someone who already works there and repurposing them for that open position? So instead of two positions, you have one.
I think that's it's dependent upon how you look at it. And the way we were looking at it is, the station is currently, my understanding, operating below its full employment level, and that we have had several open positions. So putting those employees in gets you back to full strength, and as you know, could save you money, but it does also have some of that risk of running with a shallower bench of employees. So as that natural attrition occurs, either you don't have somebody immediately available to step into that role, or you're bringing in a new employee, training them up, getting them experience in the role and trying to put them in, which can oftentimes cost more. So I think what we were trying to look at is there's not necessarily a clear cost or benefit to doing it. To some degree, as you know, you have an open position at Comanche 3 and a guy from Comanche 2 fills it. Well, it's really a savings, because now I don't have to hire two people, but it does take away from that benefit of having that deeper bench of employees to help fill gaps and reduce overtime at the plant.
Okay, and related to that deeper bench, the second benefit that you identified in your testimony was it, quote, it provides optionality as the company enters the just transition solicitation and transitions its workforce for a clean energy future. I was reading that and thinking, are you essentially saying that customers will pay for workers who may not necessarily have a role right now, but may be used in a future solicitation or a future bid by public service to own additional generation?
Not exactly. The assumption that we were making is we want to retain the employees, the workforce that we have today. We have options for them at the plant currently, and there's a need for employees at the plant currently. We have needs across our system as well. And so from the perspective that I was trying to provide is rather than simply releasing those employees and saying, you're not needed at Comanche 2, so we're just going to let you go. We wanted to retain that experienced employee and ensure that they remained with the company so that one, we have experienced employees that we can use to operate Comanche 3, but two, as that unit starts to retire, we're either able to shift them to another position, or if new generation is built in the Pueblo area, shift them to that generation. It's kind of taking a long-term view to the workforce strategy of keeping the employees around, keeps the experience around. It maintains that bench that I keep referring to, and means that in the future, when we do have additional needs, we have those employees there that can be reskilled and retrained. We're not going back to the market, trying to find new employees, trying to bring new people on. So I did not mean to imply that we have a lot of employees who are just kind of hanging out, getting paid with nothing to do all day. There's certainly plenty of work at Comanche Station for them in the future, but it gives us that optionality in the future that we don't have to go back and try and hire, train, reskill new employees. We have existing employees who are familiar with many of our systems and how the system operates and can maybe more easily slot into future positions.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to get into cost allocation just with a couple more questions. We hit on it a few times, but you indicate that the company's ownership allocation for Comanche Station is 76%, but the ownership allocation for Unit 3 alone is 67%. And so I think this relates to what we were talking about before. So is it reasonable to expect that the company's allocation of those common costs will go down in the future versus what it has historically been?
Yes, this is exactly the kind of discussion we were having earlier. I think our assumption is that should go down. I don't know whether I'd say it would go down to exactly 67% or something, but I think our expectation is something lower than 76%. It's that conversation is still ongoing with the other partners to the unit. And so I don't have a final number to say this is what it will be going forward. Those conversations are still happening. And was where I was trying to indicate there that as those conversations settle out, we may see shifts in future forecasts reflecting how those changes occurred.
Okay. But to your knowledge, in the current phase 2 forecast, no specific change in allocation was utilized.
Yes, in the current phase 2 forecast, there's no assumed change in the allocation relative to the let me be more clear in the terms. In the upcoming JTS modeling, we utilize the phase 2 forecast, so there is no change planned for kind of what common cost allocations look like.
Okay. If this commission were to accept the PIM that you'd put forth, would the company make any internal adjustments to even that up if the allocation were to go down in the future, so that did not unduly influence what the company's expenditures look like?
I don't think we had any intention or in conversation with the stakeholders had a specific plan for we will reevaluate any of the baselines at a future date. The thought in development of the PIM was to keep that simple, in that you want a very clear baseline over the period of time to which you're operating towards. And we didn't want to come in with several reopeners to revisit adjusting baselines. That I think our thought would make it more complicated to do and really results in here's the PIM as proposed, but as you know, you've got to follow the specific place in the future where this announcement was made, that this change was made to the baseline. And that just starts to complicate both the external ability for stakeholders to review and understand the PIM, but also the internal ability to remember what is the baseline I should be using here? What is the change that, you know, what is the number that my baseline should be in this year?
Okay. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about capital versus O&M. Help clarify some things for me. So can you describe to me how the company assesses if a project for Unit 3 is an O&M project or a capital project?
I'm going to refer you to Mr. Huddleston on that one. I think he's the finance expert. I think can more accurately probably explain those things than I could.
Okay. Let me see my next question for you then. Let me see. I'll give him a few of those then. Okay. Within your testimony, though, you described the treatment of costs under the PIM, and say that well, I guess not even under the PIM. This is just generally. In your testimony 164, you said any capital costs incurred in the final year of expected operations of Unit 3 for accounting purposes would be treated as an O&M expense. Can you explain what leads to that reclassification in the final year of life?
Yeah, my understanding is that's because there's no depreciation period for that, because it's the final year. There's no timeline in which you can depreciate the capital costs. So from an accounting perspective, you treat it as O&M because it will only have a useful life essentially of 1 year.
Understood. Okay, thanks for that. Now in hearing exhibit 163, you talk about how capital costs will be treated like O&M in the PIM, sort of in one way, but not the other way. So that's what I want to explore here. So explain to me, it's on page 14, if you want to find it. Page 14 of 163. So my understanding of that is that you don't intend to kind of mark it up for WAC and all the other expenses. Is that a fair way to interpret that? As on.
Yeah, that's what we're actually trying to say there is that it's evaluated as in that the total capital cost occurs in that year, or the total capital cost there. It doesn't look at the depreciation of it. So from a recovery perspective on a capital project, if it's depreciated over 5 years, you have the revenue requirement over the 5 years to recover that cost. But from a PIM perspective, it accelerates that and says, if you spent $5 million in capital on this project, we're going to evaluate whether that $5 million in all of year one, not say, for example, it's 20% of that 5 million, it's 1 million for each of the 5 years of the depreciable life of that. So that's where, from a kind of cost of service, cost recovery perspective, the PIM differs in that it's looking at everything like O&M. O&M is a 1 year cost. It looks at capital as it's a 1 year cost, not the depreciable life of that cost as it would otherwise be recovered.
Okay, that makes sense. Isn't one other outcome of treating it like O&M that you would be excluding like the company's margin and WAC markup on that expense?
I don't know if those costs are built into the assumption. Mr. Huddleston might know the answer to that. If a $5 million capital cost is just a round number, if that is just capital, or if that capital includes the recovery of WAC and a return on it, I might ask him to weigh in on whether it is, as you say, treated exclusive of those, or it is somehow included in the assumptions we made.
Okay, I can ask him. And then for the capital costs associated with the PIM, your plan is to use the actuals. So if we're talking about 2025, you would see what money was actually spent in 2025 to compare to the baseline, right?
Yes, using 2025, since that's when the PIM would go into effect, the kind of one clarification I'd say is we're looking at capital additions that begin in 2025 or beyond. So it's kind of starting fresh from a perspective of a performance incentive of saying there's always work that's being done in previous years that to some degree bleeds over into the next year, but we needed to start at kind of a fresh point as the kind of assumptions do, and then go from there. So we're saying as of January 1st, 2025, any capital expense incurred in 2025 would then be compared to the forecast of capital expense in 2025. And then 26, 27, 28, 29, we would look at the capital incurred in those years versus what the budget was.
Okay. So if there's a capital project that started in 2024 but did not end yet, its costs would be excluded from the PIM, any bleed over costs into 25, 26, anything like that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then if I have a capital project that starts in 25, but it's gonna incur costs in 25 and 26, they would show up in each proportion that they are spent in the year they are spent?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so it seems like it's just a 2025 issue where perhaps you wouldn't use this term, but I would say some of the expenses are being prorated because certain things are not showing up. Say work that's being completed in 2025, perhaps some that go into 2026. I don't know how long of projects some have. So is there any adjustment in the baseline assumptions to account for this different treatment of expenses that straddle from 2023, 2024 onward, essentially capital that is actually being spent in 25 or 26, but that's not going to show up?
There was no adjustment made to the baseline for that specifically. The reason we did that is, as I said, just to kind of start cleanly in 2025, because the annual forecast that we had there, to the extent a project started in 2025, we didn't want to burden 2025 with projects from 2024 that if they ran long, the phase 2 forecast didn't assume projects ran long or anything like that. So there's not an adjustment, simply to answer your question, made to the baseline for that. No.
Okay. Do you have any kind of anticipation as to a dollar value of capital projects that could lead over from prior years into spending in 2025?
I don't. Yeah, I don't have any expectation of costs today, at least a dollar amount that I would say it's X dollars that would bleed over.
Okay. So this accounting for within the PIM capital cost in the year in which they're actually paid or where the expenses are incurred differs from how the company plans to approach O&M within the PIM, right?
The cutoff period, yes. The kind of capital additions beginning January 1st, 2025 going forward is different, but I think that's different from the perspective of O&M doesn't bleed over in the same way. With a capital project, it's a long-term thing that occurs over a period of time versus O&M of employee labor just occurs discretely in the time period that the employee is working. There isn't a bleeding of the employee labor started on Monday, but somehow continued working into Tuesday. It's that day ended, the employee punched out, moved on. So
I was talking about a bit more of a profound difference in how you plan to account for it in the PIM, and that I believe in your testimony you refer to the company plans to account for O&M in the PIM only essentially as it appears in rate base, not as the actual expenses are incurred. Is that accurate?
Yeah, apologies, I misunderstood your
No
question.
worries.
And that is accurate. Yes, when we worked with the parties, the assumption we made there is that if in rates, for example, we were only recovering $30 million of O&M in a given year, but we spent 31, that's $1 million of O&M the company didn't recover in that year. And so customers ultimately never paid for that $1 million of incremental O&M. So you're correct. In a capital perspective, since that goes into effect as part of a future rate case when the capital asset goes into service, we would treat those two differently for the purposes of the PIM.
Okay. So in your PIM calculator document, you show kind of the changes to O&M, fixed O&M, I should say, year after year. But in actuality, the way that you're presenting it, the fixed O&M would stay fixed at whatever rate until the company came in for a rate case. Is that correct? Or I would say got a rate adjustment. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so in actuality, it would work, I think, a bit differently than what we're seeing in the calculator, in that the fixed O&M value would just stay the same for years until the company got a rate adjustment, in which case it would presumably bump up if you showed higher fixed O&M.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to characterize it. Yes.
Okay. Now with on the capital side, the company still is incurring costs that have not yet flowed through to rate base, but you anticipate treating those differently. I'm not sure I understand why you would treat one bucket different than the other bucket. And I'm somewhat concerned that expenses can shift from one to the other, as we've seen throughout these forecasts. So I'm a bit concerned about looking at different treatment when there is the possibility for some movement or reclassification. So I'm not sure I understand why they would be treated differently.
So I think the main reason to treat the O&M differently was that example of if the company had $30 million in its base rates for the fixed O&M of the unit, should the company spend more than that? The company never collected any of that money from customers. So effectively, if you applied a penalty to O&M for overspending O&M above what was in base rates, you're double penalizing the company for it. You're saying you never got this money, but because you overspent money that customers never paid you for, we're going to penalize you for spending money that you never recovered anyway. So that's the treatment difference there. Whereas with capital, because it does have that future kind of prudence review when it goes into service and we put it in a future rate case, there is that opportunity for parties to look at it and say, okay, your budget was $5 million in capital that year. You spent $6 million, so you paid a penalty. Was $6 million the appropriate amount to put into rate base or not? It was kind of just a different way from rate making is treated. Now, from the perspective of shifting dollars from capital to O&M, I do think there's potential for that, but I don't think it's a frequent occurrence that you take capital and make it O&M. And so I don't think that there is a high risk that we're going to look at it and say, oh, we're short, we're under on O&M, but over on capital, let's reclassify capital project as an O&M project. I think one, that wouldn't be consistent with the appropriate accounting treatment. And two, doing so would obviously have the potential drawback of then not being able to earn any return on that capital investment in the future.
Okay. But as I see this, thinking this through in the context of $1 million annual cap, I think we've gone over, it's very reasonable that this actual fixed O&M within the actual PIM as it's being calculated will not change until you get another rate adjustment. So the PIM calculator assumes it will keep going up, even though by your design, it will not keep going up until you get a rate adjustment. So doesn't this just kind of bake in the chance that the company gets a bonus for all the years in the interim until you have a rate adjustment, because your fixed O&M under the structure you've made can't go up until you have a rate adjustment?
I think I guess I would clarify one thing in there, and hopefully I'm understanding your question correctly, is the baseline O&M expense and that MVP, I think it's MVP attachment MVP1, that line B baseline O&M expense, that does remain, that's unchanged from what's in there in that calculator today. But that blue line I O&M expense included in base rates, we set it equal just to have a value in there. And I think you're correct that, for example, if in base rates today, there's $33,714,000, that would carry through consistently going forward. And that was, again, by design of one, didn't want to penalize the company by saying you didn't recover money, but we're also going to penalize you for spending money you weren't able to recover either. But it does provide us an incentive to not continue to grow O&M, especially in excess of the numbers that we have in those baseline cost years. So it was intentionally done and when we worked with the parties on it to, one, avoid that double penalty, but two, continue to provide an incentive for the company to reduce O&M over time, or at least hold it constant. I don't think there's any natural incentive here, or there's, I guess, for lack of a better word, a gaming going on where the company is now guaranteeing itself some sort of incentive because of its O&M costs. Because effectively we manage to what's in our base rate forecast to some degree. We don't manage to what the phase two assumptions were. If a rate case has a different number than what the forecast was, we manage to what we have been approved to spend, not what we forecasted to spend.
Okay. But if we look at like 25 to 26 within MVP one, the on line I, the O&M expense included in base rates increases from 33.7 million in 25 to 42.2 million in 26, which is a 34% increase. But presuming you don't come in for a rate base adjustment between those two, you just got a 34% higher baseline with no expectation that more money will actually be included in rate base between 25 and 26.
I think that's fair, but that also means the company is managing towards an O&M budget of $33 million instead of $42 million, or is otherwise making decisions elsewhere amongst the company to not spend O&M dollars on other projects or on other work, and instead spend O&M at Comanche. So it doesn't inherently provide some clear incentive to, for example, not come in for a rate case. Because if you don't come in for a rate case and you don't readjust that number, you're either managing to a lower budget than's in the forecast, but you're foregoing other opportunities, or you're overspending what's in your budget and then not recovering those dollars through rates.
Okay. Chairman, I maybe have 15 more minutes of questions. I want to see if you wanted to take a break or what you're.
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break till 10:35 and keep going. 10:35. Thanks. Going, Commissioner Goman.
All right. I want to talk a bit about work done in 2024. So as I understand it, one of the drivers of increased O&M costs in 2024 is a 2022 insurance event that was later determined to not be covered by the claim. So I was just curious, any additional information you could provide about the nature of that claim?
The extent of my knowledge on that is that we submitted the insurance claim, and the insurance claim was in part denied. I think Mr. Huddleston might have a little bit more detail as to what the insurance claim was for, and I may ask him to address your question more directly.
Okay, so you don't know what this event was?
No, apologies, I do not.
Okay, and you don't know a dollar value?
I don't off the top of my head now.
Okay. See. Okay. Do you know why it turned into a higher O&M cost? Why it was classified as an O&M cost?
I believe it was classified as an O&M cost because while we assumed it would be covered, it wasn't, and so that was just an expense that we had to incur and recognize it as an expense. Mr. Huddleston can maybe walk through the accounting aspect of it a little bit more detail if you'd like.
Okay. So the company indicates through your testimony that it did a complete overhaul in 2024. I was just curious, when was the need for and the timing of that complete overhaul identified by the company?
I don't know when it was identified that a complete overhaul was needed. I think those do occur in regular kind of intervals. And this overhaul did begin this spring and I believe concluded at the end of May. Mr. Zarang might have a better idea of when this was identified and like maybe the why.
Okay. So you're not aware of when that overhaul was originally planned for?
I'm not off the top of my head now.
Are you aware if it shows up in any of the other forecasts?
I don't know if it does. My presumption is there are some overhauls or assumed in each of the forecasts, but whether they occurred in 2024 or not, I don't know that answer.
Okay. And you talked about an increase of scope to the overhaul, I think kind of as issues were identified. So I was curious if the components and the scope of that overhaul were intended to be included in future years of the forecasting and were moved up either because they were found to be necessary or because it was convenient to actually complete them in 2024.
Mr. Zarang, I think, can confirm this for you. There may have been some things that were, hey, we can do this now while we're there. My understanding is, though, some of these things are, as you're doing the overhaul, you're taking apart a piece of equipment. You identify things that before you couldn't have seen, you didn't know were there. You had to really take it apart and look at it to see. So he may be able to provide some more specifics as to why the scope changed.
Okay. Yeah, and I looked at in your testimony, you had indicated that the overhaul included over 35 O&M and over 20 capital expenditure projects. I tried to cross-reference what you'd included in your testimony with the line items in attachment MVP2 to try and understand the itemization of different projects. In MVP2, I counted 39 individual items of your 55 that were completed in 2023 or 2024, some combination, that were not identified in the phase 1 forecast, many of which were also not identified in the 2023 ERP annual reporting. So I was just curious if these were things that the company already knew needed to be done and were planned for future years, or if the company had no idea this work would need to be done in the future.
That's probably the same thing. I'd say Mr. Zarang probably has more insight into what was done specifically during the overhaul and whether that was either advancing a future project or it was something identified as part of the overhaul processes. Again, taking apart a piece of equipment and identifying additional work was needed.
Okay. Are you familiar when the need for the auxiliary boiler was originally identified?
So the need for an auxiliary boiler, my understanding, it was been known as a need since the unit was designed. That is because the unit was not designed to operate without that auxiliary power source, whether it's Comanche 2 or an auxiliary boiler. I think this is, in retrospect, something we probably should have done a better job of communicating about. We had viewed the need for an auxiliary boiler, I think, as a normal course of business, that as Unit 2 retires, an auxiliary boiler is constructed in order to maintain the continued operations of Comanche 3. And so it wasn't necessarily detailed out, in part, I think, because it was just viewed as a normal course of business and wasn't explicitly expressed to everyone. I do know initial kind of planning for that began in roughly 2019, 2020. And it was started pre-COVID, during the pre-COVID era, as far as like scoping what the auxiliary boiler would be, getting initial plans, designs, and engineering done, and has continued over the last couple of years.
Okay. Did the company, sorry, like some sort of fighter jet overhead. Okay. Did the company make any adjustments to the phase 2 forecast to account for any work that was done during this complete overhaul of the unit, which may have been planned for future years?
I don't think there were any adjustments made to the phase 2 forecast for that. No, I don't believe we adjusted the baseline forecast for that assumption. I do think that's one of the benefits of using phase 2 as the baseline and then allowing the company and kind of setting that baseline ahead of time is it does give us the ability, with having a set known baseline in the future, kind of going back to our earlier discussion of adjusting baselines in future years, is knowing what your baseline is upfront and early allows the team to plan appropriately for that baseline and know, hey, it makes sense for customers to shift a project up a year and have the certainty of, if I shift the project up based on the baseline, here's what the outcomes are, versus that kind of reevaluating what your 5-year forecast or reevaluating your baseline for a new 5-year forecast every year doesn't give you that long-term planning look. That as you're attempting to manage towards end of life, you want to be able to look ahead and say, okay, I'm going to need to do X, Y, and Z in the next couple of years. What's the most beneficial way to execute those projects for customers?
Yeah, just in this case, we have projects that might have been advanced entirely out of the time period in which the PIM applies, which is a unique circumstance. I think you'd agree.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. I don't believe there were any adjustments made in phase 2 for that. Again, the phase 2 cost assumptions, those were developed in 2022, 2023 in line with that. So the 2024 overall hadn't even happened at that point.
Great. Now, does the 2024 ERP annual report forecast capture any adjustments or acknowledgement of work done during the complete overhaul in 2024?
That forecast was developed, the 2024 forecast was developed in December of 2023. So no, I don't think, if there was something that as they took the unit apart, began the overhaul and identified something that forecast would not capture that. I would think the 2025 forecast would likely capture some of that by identifying that we accelerated this project from 25 to 24.
Okay. Let's see. So just wanted to talk for a minute about the $1 million annual cap that's proposed. So that's on both the upside and the downside, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So in short, as I understand it, once the company gets to an $1 million share, your 20% share gets to $1 million in either a benefit or a penalty for any single year. Any additional overruns would no longer have any sharing mechanism that applies. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The one, I think, caveat I would make to that is we built in that specific language, especially around capital, that the parties all retain their rights to review the prudence of any capital investment. So if, for example, a capital project goes significantly over budget, while on the performance incentive mechanism side, the company is capped at that $1 million. As far as a disincentive or a penalty goes, there is still that prudence review opportunity. Similarly, on the incentive side, if the company finds significant savings or anything like that, there is that customer protection that maybe to your earlier point, we can't shift everything out of future years and put it into 1 year in order to kind of manage towards the PIM because the benefit of that $1 million is limited to protect customers from that, kind of to prevent any unintended consequences of the PIM.
Okay. I think those are my only questions, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a few questions. In your PIM testimony, you state that there is a cap of $1 million. Does that cap reset every year, or is it a one-time incentive and cap?
No, that is an annual cap. So it is a $1 million cap in each PIM evaluation year.
All right. Let me represent to you that in his clean energy plan testimony in this case, Mr. Eiley discusses over $5 billion in new generation investment and requests price adjustments of over $300 million, more than half of which would accrue to company-owned projects as proposed. So assuming you accept that representation, given that the at-risk money under the PIM cap seems tiny compared to what we're dealing with in this case and elsewhere, do you believe this capped PIM will have a significant influence on the company's behavior?
I believe this PIM will have a significant impact with respect to the company's behavior related to Comanche 3, yes. We worked with Mr. Zerang, for example, who manages the plant, and the $1 million is a material item for them. As I think we noted in my PIM testimony, this one unit alone is 1/3 of what the previous availability factor QSP target was.
Given that the company apparently knew about the auxiliary boiler issue for over a decade, can you help me understand why this commission wasn't informed about the need for the auxiliary boiler investment in the phase 1 ERP process, given that we were setting a retirement date based in significant part on the forecasted benefits and costs?
I believe that was just a failure of transparently providing the information. While I think the company has long known the development and planning for it hasn't been going on for over a decade now. That was more of as designed. The understanding at the time was you will need some sort of auxiliary resource to start the unit up. In retrospect, in phase 1, we should have been more clear about it and clearly delineated those costs in there. But I don't believe in phase 1 with an assumption that it was retiring in 2040. I just think there was something lost in there that became more acute with the retirement moving up to 2030 and a further reevaluation of phase 2.
Should there be consequences for the failure to provide that information when we were making the economic decision on Comanche?
I don't think the inclusion of the auxiliary boiler, I think as I may have talked about in my supplemental, relative to the phase 2 cost forecast, the company's current capital cost forecast is still less than what was in phase 2. So I don't think the inclusion of the aux boiler costs would have materially changed considerations given the way that the modeling in phase one and phase two looked. As far as a continued review, as I said, there is obviously the opportunity for the commission to evaluate the prudence of the investment through a future prudence review. And parties retain their rights to review that in the future. And I think we expect to fully explain the costs and benefits of what that looks like at the time.
Are you aware of any proposal in this case or anywhere else that would set the depreciation period for the aux boiler capital spending? Given that Unit 3 is retiring in 2030, is it 7 years? Is it 30 years? Is it 3 years? Do you have any understanding what the amortization period is?
I'm not confident of what it would be, and I think Mr. Huddleston might have a better idea of if there's something in place or what the assumption around that would be.
And what would happen to any unamortized balances when Unit 3 retires? Is that a stranded cost?
I believe the coal asset cost recovery proceeding addressed some of this, where unamortized balances for the retiring coal units would be evaluated and then either considered as part of that reg asset or securitization process.
Is it fair to say that any depreciation period decision would ultimately be at the commission's discretion in the next rate case or elsewhere? You know, and assuming the decision was based on record evidence and due process, is that a fair characterization that it's sort of in our realm of discretion and authority?
I believe so, yes.
And in your view, given this discretion, would there be anything that would prohibit this commission from deciding to set the depreciation period to zero, either in this proceeding or later when the spending went into rates?
I'm not a rate-making expert. It's not typically something I do, though. I'm not clear if that would be consistent with how traditional regulated utility rate-making occurs, and if there would be questions around the consistency of that with how capital investments are treated.
Fair enough. That's all I have. Mr. Larson, redirect.
Mr. Chair, may I confer with my co-counsel for a moment?
Yep.
We have no redirect, Mr. Chair.
Would you, I guess, I don't have, I have questions for Ms. O'Neill, but not for the other public service company witnesses. Let me just ask you, Commissioner Gilman, it sounds like you do have follow-up questions.
There were several that were kicked to, I think the name is Huddleston. I would see if I can end it there without the ring, because I think many more were kicked to Huddleston. So I could just try. I think it's only maybe 8 or 10 questions.
All right. Well, Ms. Pescucci is already excused. You want to call your next witness?
Yes,
Mr. Huddleston. Oh, sorry.
Apologies. Go ahead.
We got to work on that, Mr. Larson.
So do I. Oh, it gets a learning experience.
Can you hold up your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Can you put your hand down? Is anybody with you or communicating with you in any way?
No.
That changes, you'll let us know.
I will.
Back to you, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Huddleston.
Morning.
Can you state and spell your name for the record, please?
Dan Huddleston, DANHUDDLESTON.
What is your title at the company?
Director of Finance, supporting energy supply specifically.
Can you just briefly describe your role at the company?
Yeah. So my role is to help with the budgeting and forecasting of energy supply down to the plant level, and also helping give variance explanations, understanding actuals versus our forecasts on a monthly basis.
And you do not have pre-filed
Mr.
testimony.
Huddleston, could you keep your voice up, please?
Oh, yes, my computer's in a weird spot, so I'm just gonna move it on my desk to see if that captures it a little bit better.
That
Is
helps.
helpful?
It does. Thank you.
Perfect.
And Mr. Huddleston, coming back to my question, you do not have pre-filed testimony in this proceeding, is that right?
I do not.
And with that, Mr. Huddleston is available for Commissioner Gilman's questions.
Commissioner Gilman.
Hi, Mr. Huddleston.
Hi there.
So forgive me, I may be a bit out of order because I have just peppered questions all around that were referred to you, so I'll try and stay organized.
That sounds good.
So the company did a complete overhaul of Unit 3 in 2024, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware of any, were the changes based on what was expected in subsequent years? Well, I guess, did the 2024 ERP annual report capture any changes for subsequent years based on work that was actually completed in 2024 as part of the overhaul?
And maybe I'll give a little bit of background, if that would be okay, of how we kind of budget projects and overhauls on a yearly basis, because I think that will help answer your question and a little bit of understanding there. On a yearly basis, we reassess all of our project and overhauls, including this complete overhaul. And the team looks at how does that impact their future timing and schedules for future overhauls. So with us having this assumption of doing an overhaul in 2024, as we're looking at our out years, that would reflect any changes associated with this complete overhaul in 2024.
So as it gets closer, but does any forecast that we're looking at here include any future changes that would be necessary because projects were moved forward in this larger scope in the 2024 overhaul?
Maybe Mr. Zurang won't be able to get completely off because the scope and things that got moved forward, I don't know if I have a good understanding of what those were that were brought forward into this. But as we would bring things forward that were originally budgeted for out years, then in our next budget cycle, those would get updated into that budget version.
And the budget cycle is generally done annually.
Correct.
Okay. I looked with your colleague at attachment MVP2, which was a listing, kind of an itemized listing of capital expenditure forecasts with some actuals involved as well. And you might recall if you were listening, but like about the fifth actual item on there is an item called COM Emergent Fund Steam Prod, which I assume is production. Now, almost all, if not all, of the phase 2 assumptions for future costs for capital are attributed to that line item. It's my understanding from the naming convention that that would represent a common expense. Is that accurate?
It would from that perspective.
Is that accurate? Do you actually expect these to be common expenses, or are they actually expenses attributed to Unit 3?
So what that line item represents, it's a placeholder that we kind of consider break fix dollars. As things break, we would try to assign some capital dollars, knowing that if there's an actual capital project that we could take from that funding. That's based on some historical averages that we've seen before in the past, just to try to give a reasonable expectation. Your question of, well, will they all be common? We don't know. It really depends on where and what will be breaking. And so when we actually create a capital project, and you can kind of see that within the other detail, we'll create a capital name project. It'll be based on Unit 3, it'll be common, it'll be based on the location of the actual break, and it will follow the allocation percentage based on our agreed upon amount with our joint venture partners for that asset classification. So it is put in that line item as more of a placeholder just to kind of get a dollar amount for the plant, not knowing where those actual projects will land throughout the years.
Okay, but in actuality, if those end up being classified as common expenses versus unit 3 expenses, they would in all likelihood face a different allocation of Fiasco's share, right?
Correct. And what we've done is we've tried to take historical averages of both common, so the PSCO share that included emergent common, emergent unit 3, emergent new common. And we just said it's usually around that 3 million. It can fluctuate based on year to year, based on operation. But as allocations go through from an actual perspective, it will be on those percentages, unit 3 or common.
Okay. Moving on to kind of the differentiation between capital and O&M. Can you describe to me how the company assesses if a specific project is a capital project versus an O&M project?
And I actually haven't read his testimony, but we have Mark Mueller, who I think has given great detail in other rate case testimony in regards to us following capital policy. I think as something breaks, we go through a capital determination process. Does it help extend the useful life of the asset? Is it completely replacing the asset, or are we repairing it? That classification follows accounting principles and accounting guidelines. And so for us, it really just depends on the work that we're getting done, and it follows those capital policies that are GAAP required, FERC required, based on what we do and where it should be fitting from an accounting classification perspective.
Okay. And we've seen a few projects shift here or there, one direction or the other, in terms of being reclassified. So is it fair to say there's some gray, some different interpretations on what the purpose of an actual project is, one direction or other, in terms of which bucket it fits in?
I think it depends what the project is. So if we were going to open up and do a full capital project, and it was, I'm just going to use round numbers here just for example purposes, $20 million, or we could spend $500,000 from O&M perspective based on the impact to our customers, we would make that decision there that it might make more sense to not do the $20 million capital project and do the $500,000 O&M project. So it's really based on the project. There's also sometimes that once we start a capital project, we may determine that it should have never been classified as capital. We went through the capital policies and it reverses to O&M. That could be also said the other way. We start doing work thinking that it will be O&M, realizing that we have to do far more work and it will be capital in nature, and it would move in that fashion. And it all depends on those capital policies and those capital accounting guidelines.
Okay. I want to talk to you just a bit about how capital costs are treated like O&M for the purposes of accounting in the PIM. So I understood from my previous discussion that in part it just moves all of the costs to 1 year instead of spreading it out. But I was curious if it also has the impact of making the total expense look smaller than what ratepayers will actually see, because it does not include like costs associated with WAC or financing or any of those actual costs that the company would see and pass through to ratepayers.
If you don't mind, you glitched out on my end, and I think it was on my end. Would you mind repeating that question? I apologize.
Yeah, sure. So you're familiar, I presume, that in the PIM, the company proposes to treat capital costs like they are O&M.
I wasn't in the PIM design, but I just looking at that table, I believe that it's based on the year that the capital expenditure happened in the O&M expenditure.
Right. So one impact of that is you just show it all in 1 year as if it was expensed. The other impact I'm curious about wouldn't it also have the impact of having those expenses appear smaller than they actually are when they pass through to ratepayers, because there is no cost of capital or any other additions that in actuality are expenses that are passed through to ratepayers added onto those capital costs.
I believe how the PIN was designed was on the fashion of the input, so the cost of it, and not inclusive of those costs that you are mentioning.
Okay. So as we look at if the PIM was designed, you know, as the company states, to share 20% of any overage or underage, I don't think that's a word, under spending, with outside of the deadband, the company's intent is to share 20% up to that cap. On capital expenses, we would probably actually be a bit under that, correct? Because we're not including all of the costs that would actually pass through to ratepayers. Does that sound accurate?
It's a good question. Let me just get a second to get my thoughts to follow along with what you're trying to get there. So, and again, I wasn't part of the team that looked at how the PIM was designed, so I may not have some of the inputs, but I think what you're getting at from the perspective of, is the company having less impact because we only have $1 million deadband when customers would be paying more because the capital additions amount associated with them? I guess
More so that if it's designed on a 20% share and there are actual costs that ratepayers will see that are not included in the calculation that associate with capital projects, aren't we actually sharing less than 20%?
I think we'd be sharing less, and then we would also be on the reverse side, earning less as well from both sides of that.
Okay. Wanted to ask you a little bit about the assertion that one driver of increased O&M costs in 2024 is 2022 insurance event that was later determined to not be covered by the claim. Curious if you can enlighten me as to the nature of the claim.
Yeah. So how insurance claims work. We spend so many $1 million, but we have a deductible, very similar like we all do with our own car insurance. So we're only eligible to pay up to what our deductible is. So we offset all of those costs into a receivable, meaning that we will get those funds back from the insurance. It's regardless of classification, O&M or capital. What we happen to go through, and I do not know the exact line item, I think the amount was about $100,000. It was an O&M cost that wasn't assured or wasn't refunded back from the insurance company. And so that is why it's an O&M cost, is the insurance amount, as we went through each line item with the adjuster, said that this is not recoverable through the insurance claim. It doesn't meet one criteria or the other. And so we had to, we unwound the amount of receivable we had, which made our O&M amount go higher.
Okay. Are you familiar at all with the nature of the claim? What was the issue?
The 100,000, I don't. I would like to be able to go back and research that to actually be able to talk to it, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay. And then curious, so the company did a complete overhaul in 2024, which ended up increasing in scope. Curious when the need and timing for that complete overhaul was identified by the company.
That one I will pass to Mr. Jurang, given the operations of when they would have been identified to do the 2024 overhaul. I think some of it is all based on runtime and operation habits that will push it between 1 year or the other, but I will punt the logistics of that to him.
Let me see. I guess just more generally, are you familiar, were any projects that were originally forecasted in any of the vintages of forecasts you pick actually completed during the 2024 overhaul that were originally anticipated to be done in later date?
I think as Michael said in the beginning, there were some capital projects that were brought forward into this 2024, the ASH project specifically, that were forecasted in outer years that were brought forward in 2024 based on just the efficiency of having that in runtime, that those were brought forward into this overhaul here.
Thanks. Those are my only questions. Appreciate it.
You may be excused. Thank you, sir. Commissioner Gilman, what next? You're muted. I assume you have a couple questions for Mr. Zerang.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's 100% necessary, so I would leave it up to you. I can do without them if you would.
Do you have a lot of questions for Ms. O'Neill? I'd love to finish before lunch, but if you want...
No, very limited.
All right. Mr. Zerang, is that how you pronounce it?
It is.
Can you raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
You do.
You can put your hand down. Is anybody with you or communicating with you in any way?
No, sir.
If that changes, will you let us know?
Yes, sir.
And since Mr. Zerang didn't submit any direct testimony, are you all right, Mr. Larson, if we just jump into Commissioner Gilman?
I am. Thank you.
Commissioner Gilman.
Good morning, Mr. Zerang. Just a handful of questions for you. Looking at the 2024 complete overhaul of the plant, I'm curious when the need for that overhaul was originally identified and what brought you to completing that work in 2024.
Sure. I'll provide you a little bit of background on the frequency of the major overhauls that we have. So major overhauls are driven by one of the biggest things is the steam turbine overhauls that you have to do. The valves themselves, they have to be done every 3 years, no more than 4. In 2024 was the 4th year since the previous overhaul on the steam turbine valves. So that drives when we set those major overhauls. And when you do that major overhaul, it's tied to doing the boiler work, everything else. So all of your other work is, because it's a kind of a long outage, all of your other work is kind of designed to go into when the steam turbine valves are overhauled.
Thanks, that's helpful. And was there work that was originally planned for later years that was moved forward to be done in conjunction with the 2024 outage and overhaul?
Yeah, other than what was previously mentioned as the ash work that was done, some of the ash pine work that was done, I can't think of anything that we pulled forward material-wise that was, of significance that that wasn't already planned. A lot of the bigger projects were all planned for that particular overhaul, other than, like I said, some of the ash work potentially.
I compared some of the scope of what was described to happen in the 2024 overhaul with an attachment we have here that we've looked at a few times. We don't have to pull it up, but MVP2, it lists a whole list of itemized projects. And of all the projects on there, as I look at them, 39 of them, which is the majority, were not identified for the phase 1 forecasting, and many not even in the 2023 annual ERP report. I understand preparation of those reports is probably not your primary responsibility, but just curious, when those projects were identified to be needed, would they have been needed no matter what, and they were done in the 2024 overhaul because it was convenient, or are these were those primarily projects you just had no idea and didn't anticipate would ever be needed?
I'd have to look at the 39 projects, but I can speak in general and give you some guidance on that. I think all of the projects that I'm aware of, and quite a few I could kind of repeat that I'm sure are part of that 39. Some of the major projects, so the controls upgrades, again, the steam turbine valve work, all of those items are usually planned out years in advance. You have to order the materials years in advance. The boiler work that was done was planned years in advance, but I'm not sure what, like you said, some phase 1 projects, when they were designed or when those were put in. I don't know the timing. I wasn't here when you did the phase 1. I wasn't part of the Excel team at that point. But a lot of the projects are, a couple of years out for planning purposes. We have to order materials, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very confident those 39 projects were somewhere in a stack of capital and or O&M projects. And again, that's the window to do them in, because that's a long outage. And you can't do them in your short 10 or 15 day outages. You have to have that 60 plus days for a lot of those projects.
Okay, thanks. Those are my only questions. Appreciate you, Mr. Zhang.
Any redirect, Mr. Larson? Oh, Commissioner Plant.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zarang, I just had one quick question for you. I think Mr. Pascucci sort of deferred this one to you. In terms of the aux boiler, can you tell me a little bit about the aux boiler system? Is it something, does it run on coal, on gas? Is it something that can be used in the system after the next 5 years, or is it something that's just sort of goes away along with the Unit 3?
Well, to start with, it runs off natural gas. That's the primary fuel for it. There's no secondary fuel, so it's natural gas only. The use of it beyond Comanche 3, I would say that's subject to whatever future generation opportunities may be on the site. And I don't know that we know what those are. But if something were to come to the site that needed a mode of steam for an operational perspective, that could certainly be used. But again, I'm not aware of what those future projects might be. There's no other use for it currently planned other than Comanche 3.
And it's specifically as a kind of a booster steam facility. It's not a generator in any way of its own. It's
No, sir, it does
got a
not provide
limited application.
Yeah, it does not provide any generation. It's used for startup. So when you start up a steam turbine, you need to pull a vacuum, and that vacuum allows a path for the steam to flow. Without that vacuum, that rotor becomes stagnant. I mean, you're in a warping, your generator or your steam turbine rotor, et cetera. So we literally use that primarily to pull the vacuum on the steam turbine for startup purposes.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson.
I just have one brief question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Zarin, good morning still, I guess. Were you here when Mr. Pascucci testified?
Yes, sir, I was.
And you heard his testimony?
Yes, sir, I did.
Can you just briefly talk about, at the plant level, as the plant director, how you think about the 1 million incentive disincentive in terms of the operations of the plant and whether it's material or not?
From a material perspective, absolutely it's material. And I'm going to say it's not just from the budgetary perspective. I'll say it's those are the things that we look at and say, hey, can we hit our KPIs, right? Our key performance indicators, whether that's performance that we talked about earlier. I think the number of the E4 of 7.9% or whatever it might be. Those are all things I think people take pride in. And so when you miss a target or you're off a target a little bit, I think that culturally has an impact in and of itself. So that's a very material thing, I think, for all of us. And cost-wise as well. Obviously, if you have a $1 million penalty to your budget, that's going to be fairly significant when you think of the scope of the Comanche budget. So I do believe that has a material impact for us.
Thank you, Mr. Zarin. I don't have anything further, Mr. Chair.
You can be excused, sir. Thank you. Mr. Kide.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Staff will call Ms. Erin O'Neill.
Ms. O'Neill, can you hold up your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You can put your hand down. Is anybody with you or communicating with you in any way?
No.
If that changes, you'll let us know.
I will.
Back to you, Mr. Kide.
Ms. O'Neill, my name is Paul Kide. I represent trial staff in this proceeding. Could you please state your name for the record and spell your name?
Sure. My name is Erin O'Neill. First name is Erin, E-R-I-N. Last name O'Neill, O''N-E-I-L-L.
And who are you employed by and what is your title?
I am employed by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission as the Deputy Director of Fixed Utilities.
Now, hearing exhibit 2708 has already been admitted in this proceeding. It is, paraphrase, it's staff's response to public services PIM testimony and also its supplemental PIM testimony. Did you prepare that document?
I did.
And Mr. Chairman, Ms. O'Neill is available for cross-examination.
Commissioner Questioner.
I stand corrected.
Commissioner Plant.
I have no questions for Ms. O'Neill. Thank you.
Commissioner Goman.
Hi, good morning, Ms. O'Neill.
Good morning.
All right, I wanted to talk through a little bit how the PIM works with you.
Yeah.
Okay. Within the PIM calculator and proposal, my understanding that which was confirmed by the company, that the O&M expense, fixed O&M expense, is proposed to only adjust as the result of a base rate proceeding. Does that match your understanding?
Yes, that matches my understanding.
So if we look at the PIM calculator from 2025 to 2026, the baseline, I believe, includes about a 25% jump in the fixed O&M between 25 and 26. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Are you aware of what the cause was for the material increase in the fixed O&M?
Not in detail. I think that was, I think our understanding was that was driven by the retirement of Unit 2 and some of the fixed costs being ported over, but we did not have the sort of detailed I think still have some questions about the detailed explanation of what's driving that difference in cost between 2025 and 2026.
Okay. But essentially it's a $9 million, rough numbers, $9 million increase. So essentially the outcome would be it would serve to increase the baseline for all of the interim years. But the company's actual spending would only be realized in a year in which it received a base rate adjustment. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
So is it a fair expectation that this would somewhat provide the company with about $9 million worth of buffer, at least for a year, maybe multiple years, until we actually see that adjustment come through to reflect the levels of spending?
So I think it creates a buffer or a different expectation in the PIM, right? What would result in a penalty to the company, but the company is not actually recovering that $9 million unless it's in rates. And I think that's what we were trying to reflect in that, is to say, the baseline sort of calculation of the PIM, what we're trying to do is compare the company's actual performance versus a forecast baseline, but not create a penalty for something that they are not getting recovery for. So again, if the $9 million jump between those two isn't reflected in rates, we wanted to take into account that actual rate recovery.
But in the real world, the company could see increases in spending in fixed O&M and receive, say, the maximum bonus. If they haven't come in for a base rate proceeding yet, it could look as though their spending has not increased.
Assuming, I think in your hypothetical, that's assuming that they are coming in underneath the baseline of what was used for the PIM. And I think that's right. So if they're coming in under their baseline of what they had forecast their spending on O&M to be, then they could earn a bonus for that, even though they're not recovering that. But again, they're still in some ways not whole, because O&M isn't reset every year. It's just based on whatever is used in a test year in a rate case. But yes, that's the intent, is to focus the PIM metric on a comparison of their actuals compared to what the PIM baseline is set at.
Okay. And there's just two things really that go into the PIM baseline. Well, there's the availability. Let's set that aside. Two costs. One is the capital additions and one is the O&M expense, right?
That's right.
And the O&M expense are on the order of 11, 12 times bigger than the capital addition estimates, right?
That's right.
So most of this deal financially is made up by those fixed O&M costs.
Yes, that's staff's understanding.
Okay. And so they'll receive from 25 to 26, a $9 million jump in what the allowable baseline would be. But absent any rate case, the expenses included in rate base will not increase, right?
Correct.
So it seems like under that scenario, it would be highly likely that they would be showing to perform extremely well under the PIM.
I would expect them to try to manage those costs to come in, underneath that that forecast amount. Yes, and I think their 2024 forecast suggests that is no longer their expectation of what they expect 2025 and beyond to be in terms of O&M expenses.
Yes. Okay, I want to talk about the $1 million annual cap just a bit. So in this situation, especially where we don't actually see the O&M being attributed to the company changing absent a base rate, it seems to me the impact might be rather lumpy here, where it could look as though they are performing well for a number of years. You get a base rate adjustment. It could look as though they're not performing well. And so we could have years of maximum bonus followed by years of maximum penalty. Is that a fair assumption of what could happen?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I would assume that, CapEx tends to be lumpier than O&M, right? O&M is more about normal operations. Obviously, some of it is lumpy and, maintenance overhauls and things like that.
I would say it wouldn't be lumpy if there wasn't this what's included in rate base business. But when you make it what's included in rate base, doesn't it make it essentially just a stair step?
I think that it's potentially lumpy for both reasons. So yes, I think there's a stair step effect of reflecting the rate base additions, and then I think there is also a underlying lumpiness in some of the maintenance cycles. For the normal, like variable O&M expenses, wouldn't expect to be terribly lumpy. Some of the other fixed O&M expenses, I think, would add lumpiness on top of the test year adjustments from rate cases.
Okay. And now we've kind of seen in some of the discussion thus far that the company, either for convenience, for planning purposes, for a whole number of reasons, can shift projects, O&M and capital, from one year to the next. Would you agree with that?
I would say that is consistent with the testimony that I heard this morning from the company. Yes.
Okay. So do you think it's rational to have a concern that the company could, say, be looking at facing the maximum penalty for a given year, let's say? At that point, once they've hit the maximum penalty, which is $1 million, you might see more projects show up in that year with no additional penalty, even though total costs have increased. Is that a rational concern?
I don't know how likely that is, but yes, that seems like clearly the math would work that way, and that there is, a possibility for such shifting in time.
Okay, so I'm trying to think through this, for lack of a better word, lumpiness of when both capital will hit, when O&M will actually hit because of the requirement that it be in base rates, which will essentially build a stair-step system for how it's realized in PIM, as well as kind of the given ability for these projects to be shifted from year to year. And I have some serious concerns about an annual cap that could incentivize some of this. Certainly not disincentivize some of this. Could you conceive of a route where we could utilize a rolling average to incorporate multiple years to avoid the sort of year-to-year look, whether it's operational differences or gaming or whatever could happen? I just conceive of this being very difficult to manage in a year-to-year sense. So could you conceive of maybe a rolling average to help to alleviate some of these concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things we were trying to avoid is just, you can imagine a world where we just do all the true up and calculate the whole cumulative impact when we get to the end of the unit's life. And that feels like a long time from now, from the company's perspective and from ratepayers' perspective. So I think what you're suggesting makes a lot of sense as sort of an in-between of those two things, of saying we're not going to do this as a closeout this PIM every year, but not also going to wait till we get to the end of 2030 and see how we did. And so I think that's what we were trying to balance, is how do you timely provide the impact to the company and, refund or, costs to ratepayers that result in a way that sort of tracks with what's going on and is timely for ratepayers. But yes, I think that there are other ways and potentially intermediate ways to do that accounting.
Those are my only questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. O'Neill, do you think the proposed $1 million cap on the PIM makes it too small to meaningfully influence company behavior? Or do you think the PIM could help the company improve the culture at Unit 3, as Mr. Zarang testified?
I think the $1 million is meaningful to the company. I think that across the company, as I understand it, we're facing a lot of different PIMs. And when you add up all of the potential risks associated with all those penalty and reward structures, you start getting to a much larger amount. So when we look at any individual PIM in isolation, it may look like a smaller amount or impact. And that's not how the company manages its PIMs, right? That we want them to be looking at all of the incentives and risks together. And so I do think staff had a concern that $1 million might not be meaningful. And, we are not the ones managing the plan, so it is hard for me to opine on whether that's accurate or not. I think the company's representation is that is meaningful. And I think staff was somewhat sympathetic to the overall concern that there's a lot of different PIMs and it adds up to, more substantive financial risk for the company.
Before this hearing, I reread the staff report about the effectiveness of the company's planning, construction, and operation history at Unit 3 that characterized the company's performance as poor and inadequate. Assuming you agree with that prior characterization, and please say so if you don't, do you think the company's Unit 3 performance has improved and has turned a corner? Or do you view the disclosure issues, forecasting misses, and other cost overruns as sort of more of the same, or do you find them understandable?
That's an interesting question. So I certainly don't disagree with anything that was reported in that staff investigation into Comanche 3. I mean, I'm tempted to say both. I mean, we're not currently facing an instance where the unit has been out for an entire year. So, that's improvement, I guess. But I do think we continue to have concerns with multiple outages, planning. I mean, I think, seeing all of the capital additions forecasts and O&M forecasts laid out, causes real concern that the company is not able to accurately predict and plan its maintenance, its capital additions, its outages, and that the lack of transparency around things like the auxiliary boiler are real concerns. I would not consider that to be ordinary course of business. And so I think it's not, yes, it continues to be a concern that there is a lack of transparency and accurate planning and forecasting around this unit.
And I know I've already asked this question, but I doubt your counsel is going to object. Do you think the PIM is helpful in encouraging disclosure, transparency, and helping to change the corporate culture, or you just don't know?
I just don't know. And I do think, as Mr. Pascucci mentioned, this is why it was very important to the parties that we retained some rights to review prudence. in things like the ECA prudence review. And I'm not saying that's an easy burden to carry, but in terms of the impact of large events or unexpected costs and outages, we retain that concern with this unit in particular, that there may be some large event that happens in the future that was not anticipated as part of this discussion, and that we wanted to retain the right to evaluate those circumstances if and when they arise.
And even if the $1 million is too small to really change behavior, which it sounds like you don't know, does it help with the information disclosure and transparency, or you can't even opine on that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's helped this discussion we've had today, and the requirements around this have helped with transparency. And it certainly provides a venue for us to focus on that and look at it, right? And ask the questions, and sort of forces a review on staff's part to look into the details of the O&M capital additions kind of spending on the unit. So to that extent, I think it forces some attention on the unit for both us and the company. But whether it creates incentives for the company to shift costs around and not necessarily transparently divulge certain information, I don't know.
All right. In your PIM testimony, you talk about the regulatory treatment of the capital cost overruns as against the phase 1 forecast. Assuming this commission focuses solely on those overruns, treats them separately from and prior to the PIM, and does not in any way provide a presumption of prudence for this spending, any further guidance if we wanted to set a depreciation period of 0 in this case or elsewhere?
And I heard your question about this earlier. I would like to be careful, because we did have a whole proceeding looking at the remaining book value of the retiring coal plants, and an understanding of how that would be treated, teeing up certain decisions to happen in the future. And I'm honestly not sure if these costs, things like the auxiliary boiler, were already contemplated to be part of that proceeding. So, which doesn't mean the commission can't change that order, just that there may be some implications from that proceeding that I didn't review. That said, going forward, I agree that I think the commission has a large amount of discretion on how it treats those assets and what the amortization or return would be on such investments.
And I guess just any guidance if we wanted to carve out this one specific capital cost overrun for greatly accelerated depreciation, any guidance, thoughts? I mean, if it's a $34 million overrun and it's a WACC somewhere between 6 or 7%, it's over $2 million a year, and probably greater than the PIM incentive just on this capital cost overrun. So any thoughts, guidance, corrections?
So let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So are you suggesting that, for instance, in the company's next rate case, or when it comes back with the securitization proceeding on the costs associated with retiring coal plants, that there would be maybe a directive to the company to separate those costs and have a separate analysis of potential treatment for those costs in such
no analysis, just 0. It just gets depreciated all at once. I don't want to say expense, but like that.
But I guess that's a legal question about whether you have the record to do that here, or that decision needs to be happen in one of those potential forward-looking proceedings, and I don't know the answer to that.
All right. There was some testimony, but from a policy perspective, your testimony was supportive of that approach. Is that fair?
It was. Yes, that is fair.
There was some testimony about O&M expenses being categorized as capital. Do you know the size of that potential problem? Do you have serious concerns about that?
This is something that we've done some looking at in a number of different proceedings, and my understanding is that there's certain accounting rules on not all O&M expenses can just be capitalized. That there's guidance on O&M and labor that occur within a capital project can be capitalized and put as part of that, but it's not, regular O&M from an accounting perspective can't just be recharacterized as capital. That's my understanding on the accounting.
So you think between GAAP and FERC accounting, it's not a substantial problem given the audits and the scrutinies and the rate cases?
Agree. I mean, I think we've been trying to pay more attention to this, and I think we don't have any evidence at this point in time that this is a problem, but it is something that staff has been paying attention to and trying to understand from the company. And I do think there's a lot of specific accounting guidance on how those costs can be treated.
Mr. Kide, any redirect?
Mr. Chair, I've had a moment to confer with the co-counsel. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you very much for your patience. We have no questions.
Thank you, sir. Ms. O'Neill, you may be excused.
Thank you.
I guess Commission Counsel is suggesting statement of positions by September 26th. Mr. Larson, Mr. Kide, others, does that work, or would you need more time?
Staff would definitely need more time.
All right. Ms. McLaughlin, are you there? Do you want to go into next week, the 2nd or the 3rd?
Yes, I think, Chair, thank you. It's up to you all and the parties on what timing you'd like. I think this is a limited issue. So going to the next week is certainly acceptable. But if you would like to ask the parties what would work, I have no concerns.
That's a risky, that can be a risky proposition, but Mr. Kide, Mr. Larson, do you have proposed dates, Mr. Larson?
I'd defer to Mr. Kide in terms of how much time staff needs, and we can work with that.
Mr. Kide?
I'm conferring. My witness just got off the stand here, so just need a moment. Okay.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Mr. Larson? We're looking at calendars over here. I mean, we could put October 3rd out there for consideration.
Yeah, I was thinking October 4th. And I think, Mr. Chairman, I have a medical procedure that's going to keep me out for some time. And that would allow me to be back and participate in a drafting of the document, and just checking all the various calendars. A lot going on.
Understood.
Well, he's checking that. No issues with October 4th from public service perspective.
Yeah, let's set October 4th, close of business. If you have problems, just reach out to Commission Counsel and we'll try and adjust, and hope your medical procedure goes well, Mr. Kide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Final matters before we adjourn, Mr. Larson, Mr. Kide?
Nothing further from the company, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kine?
Nothing further from staff.
As always, thanks for the information and the hearing and the conversation. Again, certainly sharpened my understanding and thinking. Commissioner Plant, any final thoughts before we adjourn?
No, appreciate the opportunity to ask some questions and get a little more clarity around the agreement. And thanks a lot.
Commissioner Gilman?
Likewise, appreciate everyone's time and willingness to come participate in the hearing. Appreciate it.
With that, we're adjourned, and everybody enjoy the free time tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.